Okay, so you've talked about ER, about West Wing, and you said you were also producing Third Watch. Before we get into Third Watch, how are you doing all of this at once? How are you balancing all these shows?
Well, the great thing, a little quick background. I was under a deal at Warner Brothers Television for several years, and it was merged with Lorimar at the same time that I was doing the ER pilot. And they had come to me, they had another year on my deal when we were doing the ER pilot. And the new Warner Brothers, because they tossed out all the old Warner Brothers people and the Lorimar people became the Warner Brothers people. Many names you would know, but I probably don't need to say. Came to me and said they didn't want to honor the last year of my deal. They wanted me to reduce what they were paying me for the overall, which is the exclusivity to just be at Warner's. And I figured out, I had 2 pilots going, and I figured out with what they were offering me, if we did a fall order on one of them for 10 or 12 episodes, that it would be more than what they were offering me in exclusivity. So I said no. This really does apply to your question. I said, no, thanks, that's cool. And they said, that's cool too. Because I hadn't been one of the Lorimar people that came over. I was like one of the leftover Warner Brothers people. So then ER goes on the air, and we're on the cover of Newsweek, and we're doing 40 shares, and somebody says to somebody else, Wells isn't under contract and doesn't have to be here, and he's going to kill us when we try to renegotiate it. So they called and said, hey, we'd like to pick up that deal we forgot. But I said, no, I'm not picking up that deal. So my agents over at CA called and said, come on over, and said, so what do you want? And I said, what do you mean? And they go, you can have just about anything. What do you want? And I said, well, I certainly want to negotiate for whatever money is appropriate for me to be making. But what I really want is the ability to not have to deal with all the crap on a day-to-day basis. I want to have an infrastructure around me that takes care of a lot of the stuff that I know that when you're executive producing can overtake your life and keeps me from being able to do what I really love, which is sitting in the room with the writers and writing and working with the directors and hiring the actors and doing all the fun stuff. So we negotiated a deal in which they provided me with a company. And in that company, we hired sort of slowly over 3 or 4 years a number of people who are really good at their jobs, handle a whole bunch of the crap. So I have this tremendous advantage which allows me to do more than one thing because I don't have to do all the rest of the stuff. I have a man by the name of Ned Haspel who runs all the business affairs. We've had Andrew Stern with me for years, and Jenny Howe now does in television. So they handle all the current, they handle all the clearances, they handle all the standards and practices, and it lets me just be with the writers. So I was able to do a lot of things at once because I didn't have to handle a lot of what other people in the position, executive producing position, have to handle. And then we set up a lot of systems, which really came from John Worth, which I learned first, and I think he would probably say it came from somebody else, and I don't know who. So everything gets done on time. We have schedules. We follow all the schedules. Everything gets done when we say it's going to get done, and it allows me to balance a lot of things at once and just work with writers. And so we had but that period of time was really tough. We had ER was going. It was big. It was in its like year 6 and 7 still. We were dealing with George's leaving and Juliana's leaving and everybody, all the cast changes. We had written West Wing the year before. Aaron had written it. We'd been trying to get it going. And then they really wanted to do a spinoff from ER. And we didn't want to do a spinoff with ER. And as sort of part of getting West Wing picked up and on the air, they said, we still really want that thing we want. So I sat down with Chris Chulak, wonderful producer and director, and came up with this idea to do a show which was sort of what happens right before you get to the ER, and sold them on that so they would leave me alone about doing spinoffs on ERs, and that became Third Watch. But it was taking place in New York. We had West Wing and ER in Los Angeles, but also both traveling to Chicago and to Washington, D.C., and it was wonderful and exciting and the worst time of my life just because I had no life for, years. And I'm really delighted with this new cable universe where you do 10 or 12, because there were, I don't remember how many years overlapped, but a good 6 or 7 years where we were 6 years where we were producing 66 hours of television a year, plus oftentimes a pilot, some short-lived series that didn't make it, thank God, because I don't know what we would have done. And I was able to do it because we had all these people that I had worked with from China Beach, then into ER, who had ambitions and wanted to be doing other things. And because I wasn't going anywhere, it let me kind of move people into other places to do other things. And so everybody kept moving up, so they didn't leave. And I got to hang on to all these talented people, writers and directors and producers that I'd been working with, who moved from one place to another. So you'll see a lot of the same names when you kind of look around.
So just talk a little bit more about Third Watch. It was about first responders, and 9/11 happened during the run of the show. How did Third Watch address September 11th?
Well, we had to address it immediately in a very practical sense, because we were working again with a number of advisors, police and fire advisors, and a number of them were there, and several of them were missing throughout the first days. Including Molly Price had married one of the firemen that she had met, one of the stars of the show, and he was missing for almost 48 hours. One of those people who wasn't able to actually make a phone call, was trying to get his friends out of the rubble, but she didn't know that if he was there or not, or if he was actually in there. And then we owned fire engines and things for the show, and so much of their material was destroyed on the day that the department called us up and asked for all of our equipment. So the Third Watch fire engine was actually on active duty for a while afterwards, and Brooke Kennedy, who was the line producer on the show, now does The Good Wife, sent over our catering, all of our lighting. We set up emergency lights at Ground Zero, and so we were out of production for quite a while. And because we knew so many people, and I think we were all searching around for what to do, I went in and interviewed a lot of the people who we worked with, and did a documentary that NBC then broadcast, called In Their Own Words, which was about a lot of the people who were there. They ended up winning a Peabody, actually, which was actually just us in the weeks afterward, trying to kind of process what had happened to a lot of the people that we knew very well. Because there were a number of people who actually appeared in the series who died that day, And it took us a little while to kind of figure out what we could possibly do. There was a sense on both West Wing and Third Watch, because of the subject matter, that we really had to deal with it. Aaron ended up writing what turned out to be kind of probably the most controversial episode that we ever did, because people either loved it or hated it, because I think there was a lot of feeling that it was a polemic. But I defended it at the time and defend it to this day as an artist. When something happens and you feel like there's something you want to say about it, you say it, and particularly if you have the soapbox from which to say it. You can agree with it or disagree with it. He had every right to write it, and it was how he felt at the time. And on Third Watch, we had to actually do it. It was impossible to do something about New York first responders and not actually do something about it. So we did the documentary, and then we worked it into our stories, and there were people who objected to it, as if we were, and said, that are we sensationalizing a tragic event? Where is that line where something has really happened, that doing it as entertainment is inappropriate? And I don't know that you can ever figure out exactly where that line is. You only have to try to be true to this notion that you're trying to be honest about how you feel at the moment with it, and you're not using it exploitively to simply generate ratings or to try and take advantage of other people's tragedy. That's a kind of a line that we're on all the time with all of these shows, in which there is melodrama that's present, in which things really happen, in which you're hearing people's real stories. All you can do is try to be honest to what your impression as an artist is of the thing that's being told to you. Or you have to remove yourself completely from it, so that it's really clear to the audience that you're commenting upon it. Again, I use the Quentin Tarantino example, where he's, clearly there wasn't a whole bunch of guys who were looking for Nazi scalps. But what is true about it is there was fury and anger about how to do it. So you're kind of in a territory where you're satirizing it, and yet there is something truthful about it, But when with the kind of things that we do in the sort of documentary reality that comes in the way in which we try and shoot them, you have to just be honest about the emotions of the people who were there. And I felt very confident doing it because I'd actually gone and personally been on this other side of this camera within 2.5 weeks of it with a number of people who had been there and had lost friends and had lost spouses and and who we knew. But these things are delicate lines, and I object sometimes to what I feel are people. The joke, the kind of the Saturday Night Live joke is somebody doing something and turning the camera going, too soon? Sometimes it's too soon. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, I think, is dependent upon how you actually choose to treat it and whether you have based it on something that's real or whether you've based it only on your impression from outside of that event of what you think it is as compared to what you actually heard from the people who were there.
Another show that you executive produced that had that kind of documentary real feel was Southland, which started in 2009 on NBC and ended on TNT.
Quickly ended up on TNT.
Tell us a little bit about creating that and the transition between networks.
Chris Chulak was, and I had been big fans as kids. We were probably in our teenage years of Police Story. And Chris had actually worked for, he's a director and producer. And he had actually worked as a young assistant on Police Story and on those shows. And Fantasy Island, he'll be happy to tell you. And we talked a lot about it, like that show isn't on the air. That's something that's interesting. We knew from the officers that we'd hung out with in New York that there was also an LA version of that, and we started doing some research on it. And Chris in particular did some research on it. Chris is from LA, grew up in East Los Angeles, and he felt that there were stories in parts of LA that just had not been on television, that she hadn't really seen. So we went out looking for someone to do it and found Ann Bitterman, who was excited about the idea. She knew a lot of police officers, had, I think at one point, either lived with or been married to a police officer. So she was she was attracted to the idea. We went out and sold it. We sold it to NBC. I don't think they realized just how real we intended it to be. But once Ann went out, spent almost a year with police officers, came back, told us the stories. We talked about stories. There was a lot of back and forth about what the show should be, about how Chris planned to shoot it, what we planned for it to be. And we went out and made exactly what we said we were going to make. They picked it up, and then the administration changed again. My sort of joke at NBC when we finished ER at the final wrap, or the final Christmas party, was I thanked all 7 network presidents who'd been there in the 15 years we've been on the air. So there was always somebody new. But the new people who were there thought that it was way too gritty and not what they wanted, and they kept giving us a lot of notes that we weren't doing. What I always refer to as the blue sky notes, like, can it be happy or can it be? And we were interested in doing just the opposite. We were interested in actually showing what it was like on a day-to-day basis to be, as best we could in a entertainment and narrative way, what it's like to be a cop on the street. So they canceled us. And we were all kind of angry about it because we felt like we had told them what we wanted to do, sold them what we wanted to do, delivered what we said we were going to deliver. It had been critically well received, and they canceled us. Now, the numbers weren't great, but it's always easy in hindsight. They'd be delighted to have that number right now because the numbers were dropping precipitously on NBC at the time. Out of the blue, Michael Wright called me, who was president of TNT, and said, "I love that show. What's the matter with them?" And I said, "Well, you should do it." And he goes, "Well, damn, I just might. Let me call you back." And he called us back, and they took it. So we got to keep making it. And I will be forever grateful. We did, more seasons of it. Show I'm very proud of. Chris did, excellent work on it. It was a very specific style of shooting, which was really useful for all of us. Again, spending lots of times with the real police officers, a lot of police officers on the set. All of the police officers who don't have lines, who are in all the scenes, are really police officers. And Chris decided that he was just going to go out and shoot the city. So we didn't do it the way you would normally do shows. So we went and we would sort of know the area that we wanted to shoot in, and then we'd rehearse it a few blocks away, and then we'd drop into the specific neighborhood and just park and shoot and then leave again very quickly. It got out of hand a couple of times. We had a long scene that was shot about officers finding a mentally disabled adult who's actually was only 16 or 17 years old, driving a car without a license, pulling him over. Much loved kid in the neighborhood, but the kid's like 6'3" and mentally challenged and driving and dangerous, and they're trying to subdue him. And, you know, we're in a real neighborhood, and people started coming out of the streets and not really noticing that or realizing, because we were a very small footprint, it didn't look like a film company. Started screaming at us and throwing stuff at us, and, you know, we actually had to finish the scene, get in the cars, and get the hell out. Well, because there were a lot of people who actually showed up who didn't realize that it was a television show. There was an authenticity to that was great, but on occasion it got a little scary. And the real cops, a lot of times people would show up around us, and the police officers would come up and say, hang on for a second, because there's a fugitive over there we've been looking for, and we're going to go get him, but we want him to think that we're still just doing the TV show. So they'd go around the corner and you know, went behind him and brought him down, everybody screaming, and, you know, hauled him off. And we had a lot of that. And Chris hired a lot of actors out of Homeboy Industries and other places, so that we had real gang members and things on it. And there's a wonderful guy that we all really liked who was in the pilot. Very distinctive tattoos and everything. He was talking to us a lot about how he was back home and working because he really wanted to be with his kid and everything. And so we wrote him into the first episodes. And when we tried to find him, we couldn't find him. And then one of the police officers who was one said, well, I'll check. They checked. He was back in for murder, violated his parole on a gang shooting, and was going to serve like 30 years or whatever. So the authenticity in that show was not made up. It was really there.
Were you able to kind of push the boundaries a little more being on TNT than on NBC?
Oh, completely, because TNT actually wanted the show that we wanted to make. Now, to that end, it was never a huge rating success for them, and Michael Wright defended it for years to keep it going, and again, I'll always be really thankful to him for doing that. We've even talked about reviving it because, again, now as these things change, people at TNT have said to us, gosh, I wish we still had that show. And I'm like, well, you still could. We're just doing another pilot for them to finish. They just picked up yesterday that's going to go to series. That's why I've been talking to them saying, we can still do that. Everybody still likes doing it. We can pick up in a minute and do that again. We didn't even have a standing set. Everything was on the street.
Wow. So let's move on to talking about Shameless, which you adapted from a British series. So what first drew you to the British version, and why did you choose to adapt it?
I wanted Andrews Jr. worked with me for years and just only recently went over to Universal. I said, you got to meet this guy, Paul Abbott. He's kind of crazy, and he's really a wonderful writer, but he's sort of you in England. And so I met with him, and we were talking about, Andrew had wanted us to do this thing called Clocking Off that he had done, which was about different people in a factory, and you kind of followed whoever hit their card. You'd follow them home, and you'd see their different lives. It's a cool idea. They'd done it, I think, for ITV. I'm not quite sure who they did it for, but it was good. So we sat down to talk about this. This was years ago. And I said, what are you working on? He started telling me he was working on was the story of his own family's life, which ended up being Shameless. I said, that sounds fabulous. That sounds as crazy as the people I grew up with. And he said, oh, well, I'll send it to you. So he sent it to me, and I read it before they actually started making it in England. And I said, oh, I want to do this. This is great. Let's do this.
So about when is this?
Well, we are it's 13 years ago because it took 7 years to get made in the States from that moment forward. Because I thought everybody'd just see what I saw in it, and I couldn't sell it. I could not sell it, largely because the people I was pitching it to kept saying to me, this doesn't exist in the United States. And I said, well, I don't know where you're from, but it exists where I'm from, and it exists with my family, and let me introduce you to some of my cousins in West Virginia. Let me introduce you to some of my relatives in various parts of the country. And I grew up around a lot of this. And I think you're ignoring the fact that there's actually an extraordinary amount of families that are really, really struggling in the country. And it was even when we were first talking about it, there was, the economic demise started to happen, and I was like, still, you guys can't see it. But we tried to sell it everywhere. It was first at Showtime briefly, then at HBO for almost 4 years. Then they gave it up, and we took it back to Showtime. Then they passed on it again. Then I took it to NBC briefly for a moment where they said they would actually do it with the content, and I said, I got to see the Standards and Practices report, and that came back, and I said, I don't think that's doing it. Took it back to Showtime, and Bob Greenblatt, who was at Showtime, said, I don't know, it makes me laugh. Here's a list of 6 actors. If you can get any of them, then we would do it. And one of the names on the list was Bill Macy. That was like on a Thursday, and this is after 7 years. I called Bill, and I said, hey, I got this thing I think you might really like. And I sent it to him, and he called me back Friday morning and said, yeah, this is funny. I'd do this. So then I called Showtime. It was literally the next day after they gave me the list and said, well, Bill Macy will do it. And they said, oh, okay, we thought we were kind of sending you off on like an errand that nobody would do, but sure, we'll do it. And they did it.
So talk about casting the rest of the Gallaghers.
That was a pleasure. Well, Bill and I had done pilots before, and then he'd been on ER. And he's just a wonderful actor and inventive and smart and fun. And so we started I thought, well, we've got Bill Macy, so we don't have to worry about who anybody else is because we can just get Bill Macy. And I'm going to return to Emmy Rossum last because that was the longest of the journeys. So we just started seeing people. We hired some people in New York and found this little girl, Debbie, to play Debbie, Emma, who was, just this precocious little redheaded kid. We couldn't find Carl, that's played by Ethan, and ended up just finding this kid basically in the street in Chicago who'd never really done anything. He's actually turned into kind of a great actor. He's really fabulous. Jeremy White came in. He plays Lip, and he had just graduated from the School of Performing Arts in New York and was sort of perfect, and cast him, and he's been fantastic. And Cameron was this kid, basically not literally living in his car, but trying to be an actor with his mom, one of those kids who was around, who came in and was terrific. Steve Howie had just finished doing Reba and just made me laugh hilariously. He was hilarious. Shanola Hampton was a bartender and trying to be an actress and has been fantastic. And then Lori Bartlett, who was at Gersh at the time, as I recall, as an agent, who I had known for years. She had represented Eric LaSalle, called me and said, you got to see Emmy Rossum. And I said, Emmy Rossum from, Poseidon Adventure and from Phantom of the Opera? She goes, yeah, you got to see her. And I said, well, I haven't heard the best things about Emmy Rossum. I've heard that she's, kind of hard to work with and a bit of a diva and everything. She goes, she's over that. Her teenage rebellion is gone. You got to see her. And I said, life's too short. I can't deal with somebody who's like a pain in the ass. So we kept seeing people. She kept calling me. She's very persistent. I said, all right, just shut up, send her in, I'll see her. She was terrific. So I called around some people. Everybody said, no, she's a real pain in the ass. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to talk to her. So I called Emmy in and I said, everybody thinks you're a pain in the ass. And she said, yeah, but you know what, I went, I had a huge rebellion, had a lot of problems, things that I was sorting out. I went home, lived in Brooklyn for a while, sort of sorted myself out. You won't have any of those issues with me at all. And she's turned into a very good friend. She has been utterly fantastic on the show and has been a leader with Bill of the cast, always on time, always prepared, always has something interesting she's doing, fearless. She and Bill together are fearless. I mean, in the first episode, they've started airing the promos for it. In the first episode, Bill's wearing like a thonged, lacy female bikini bottoms around. And so, that's just proven to me again that, people tell you about someone, you need to sit down and make your own judgments about who they are and what they're going to be. And it came together, and Showtime has continued to let us make it. I keep thinking they're going to call up and say, no, you can't do that. That's too far. Now, I will say, and people find it hard to believe, that all of that show is just as researched as any of the other shows that we've ever done. All of the writers, all of us have complicated, that's a nice way of putting it, backgrounds with complicated families and things that have gone on. So we get together and we tell our stories, and they get made more comic, they get broader, but all of it's true. The cocaine story of, someone a kid getting into Emmy's cocaine is something that happened to a roommate of mine, when I was in my 20s. And that story is almost exactly what ended up happening to her in this case. The bipolar disease that's portrayed on the show is from my family. I only feel comfortable revealing what's from my family, but I grew up with a lot of people with a lot of mental illness. We make fun of it. It wasn't all that funny at the time, but I remember laughing about it. And at the core of it is this idea that, and this was from Paul, that this was really his family and his people, that no matter how crazy things are, we survive by kind of sticking together and loving each other. And then it lets us do a lot of kind of social commentary on just how tough it can be for people to get out of this world. Now, this is our 6th season, and there's a lot of conversation now about income inequality and the difficulty. It was a big Pew, I think it was a Pew study that came out yesterday about how once you fall out of the middle class or you're not in the middle class, it's almost impossible to move, that the upward mobility has stopped for most people in the society. That's what we're trying to dramatize. We make a lot of fun of it. Nothing is sacred. It is called Shameless. But it is, we did a whole storyline about infertility and on the show, which really comes from my wife and I. There was a suggestion from one of the fertility doctors that we saw that we get eggs or I have sex with other members of my wife's family. The guy, it was completely straight-faced, talking to us. Like, you can't make that up. So we just did it rather than just suggest it. And I remember asking him, do people really do that? And he goes, oh, yeah. I'm like, well, no, they don't. He goes, oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I've had it in my practice. Science face without any. So I said, that's going in something. That's going somewhere. And that's where it went.
So it sounds like you did a lot of original storylines. How much did you take from the British series?
We completely took the architecture in the sense that the British series is Frank, Fiona, Lip, which is really Paul, his brother, 2 of his other siblings, and their neighbors. The thing that happens when you do, and I'm sure you've talked to Norman Lear and other people about, adapting these shows, what happens is you start with the architecture, but the actors tell you where you're going to go, right? So as an example, in the British series, the pilot is very similar, and then there are a couple of episodes that have other elements, and then everything goes completely different. Now, there's really strong reasons for that. In the British series, the Fiona character that Emmy Rossum plays, her boyfriend is played by James McAvoy. James McAvoy and the woman who played Fiona fell in love, and they left the show. So they're literally only in the first season, of the show, and then they're gone. So the whole show has to be very, very different. In the British series, they were very, Paul had a lot of difficulty with the kid who was playing Lip, loved the kid who was playing Ian, so Lip got written less and less. The Debbie had to become a huge character almost immediately because Fiona had left. They did our Sheila, played by Joan Cusack, who was fabulous, left very early because she had other opportunities to do other things. So the show becomes, you start writing very quickly to who your actors are in these stories, and the shows become really different. In the same way that you can go and watch the British series that All in the Family is based on, and it's absolutely the same series and completely different all at the same time because culturally it's different, the characters are different, the actors are different, you're playing it in different ways.
So Emmy Rossum and Bill Macy have a lot of input, or their relationship in real life kind of plays into Fiona and Frank.
Well, Bill is completely different than Frank, and by that I mean he is lovely and funny, but a little introverted and a little shy. He's not kind of out front. Fiona has become in many ways Emmy, because she is very vivacious and alive and kind of and vivid as a person. So we write to that quite a bit, and she and Shanola have become very good friends, so we write to that. Jeremy's very, has a kind of an interior James Dean kind of thing that goes on, so we write to that. Cameron is sort of stoic and a little removed, and so as we watch that go, I said, oh, well, we should play. He reminds me of some people that I know in my life. We could take that quality and take it to a different extreme and have him deal with bipolar disease and all the ways in which you can actually, as tragic as it can be, that you can actually figure out how to live a life with that. And we've been very proud of kind of the sexual relationships that we've played in the film. The homosexual relationship between Mickey and Ian, which turns into there's another character this year with Ian. The growth of someone who's first ashamed of their sexuality and who comes to embrace their sexuality and celebrate it, and that kind of passage. The mistakes that we all make. I mean, all these stories come from somebody in the room pitching some screw up, something they did, something they're proud of or not proud of. We laugh about it and then kind of cry about it sometimes at the same time.
I mean, there is absolutely a lot of, comedy in the show. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between these serious issues and the humor, which is not an easy thing to do?
Yeah, I'll go back actually to China Beach, which is an interesting thing. Is Bill Broyles used to come in all the time and chide us and say it was funny. Stop making it so serious. We had a lot of fun. I laughed a lot. I've never laughed as hard as I laughed when I was in Vietnam. And we'd go, really, Bill? What was so funny in Vietnam? And he'd say, oh, here's a story. So we're out on patrol, and the guy who's on lead, his name is Lemon. And we're walking through, and he trips a mine, and it blows him all to shit. He's like all over the place. And we got, pieces of him on him, and it's up in the trees and everything. And we're standing there, and we're just all completely in shock. Nobody wants to move because we don't know where there are other mines. And then one of the guys in the back who's kind of a joker starts singing, lemon tree, very pretty, and the lemon's so sour and sweet. And we all started laughing. And we're all looking at him in horror, like, Bill, that's not funny. But the truth is that when you're in difficult situations, our natural inclination as human beings is to make fun of it, is to be funny, is to find the humor to remove the horror of what's going on around us or the tragedy of what's going on around us. That's why people laugh a lot in the weirdest places you laugh. I mean, Jim Brooks and everybody at Mary Tyler Moore did it better than anyone will ever do it in the clown episode, the clown funeral episode. I mean, that's true, right? So the more difficult the situation, the more you have to figure out how the human beings in the situation are going to find a way to make it humorous, because that's what we naturally attempt to do. And people who don't do that are people you don't really want to be around very much, because you sort of perceive them to be a little self-involved and melodramatic and blah, blah, blah. We're always trying to find it. So the balance we're trying to find all the time is making you laugh uncomfortably about something you know to be true that you want to laugh about, right? That the corollary to it, which is something that we try to avoid completely, is what's going on right now with the Donald Trump campaign for presidency, where he takes that thing that nobody wants to say and says it. We try and take the event that isn't funny, but we know has some inherent humor in it, and find a way to make it funny by exaggerating it, by exaggerating the circumstances, and then letting us understand we can cope with it. A lot of what we want to get from our entertainment is, here are things that I'm afraid of, like on ER. I'm afraid of what the government's actually doing on West Wing. I'm afraid of having to live in poverty and not knowing where my money's going to come from and not be sure when I'm going to be out on the street or not. These are things that we are genuinely afraid of. We can sit on those emotions and those feelings, but they're there. So as writers, as directors, as actors, we can go at those things, let you experience it, and then let you see how you survive it. Through humor, through tears, but you still go on, right? You still pick up. We are survivors. As human beings, we survive. So you can do that by finding the way that somebody walks back outside of that hospital after the worst day of their life, and the sun is shining, and you're like, wow, the sun is shining. I just assumed it wouldn't be shining, because life is going to go on. You can take it like how you end up laughing about something that's not funny at all, and yet we know in Shameless that it actually is kind of funny, right? these things, these fears we have, because we are going to survive. We are going to actually get by with our friends and our family and the people who care about us. We will figure out how to get on the other side of it. When I was spending a lot of time in hospitals, I was always amazed at how many people were laughing in the oncology ward and in the dialysis unit. One of the first things you notice in the dialysis unit is there are people in there telling jokes, right? You have to tell jokes. You're in the dialysis unit. It's the most depressing place on earth. So what do? You talk about what's funny, what you saw that was funny, about the things that are life-affirming. So these horrific things that we portray happening to the Gallagher family are oddly life-affirming because they still are standing at the end of it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the answer to that question as best as I can articulate it.
Mm-hmm. You guys do something a little bit different with the intros to the recaps each week. You have the characters break the fourth wall and talk directly to the camera. Tell us a little bit about that decision.
Well, I've been doing recaps forever. And it became kind of a regular thing. I think Hill Street sort of started. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. Somebody started it. They're really kind of irritating, right? It's like, pay attention, for Christ's sake. Just pay attention to the damn show. So we wanted to be a little different. There were a couple of things we did right off the bat that I really wanted to do. One was there was a lot of conversation about how do we warn the audience about what they're going to see. And I said, well, we'll just do it in the main title. And I said, what do you mean? And I go, well, I don't know. I'm just going to put a bunch of main stuff in the main title that you don't have to have a warning up there. If you watch the main title and you still watch the show, you cannot be complaining that you saw something you didn't want to see. I mean, there's somebody's masturbating in the main title. Somebody's having sex in the main title. Somebody's been beaten up in the main title. A kid is using toilet water to brush his teeth. I mean, if you don't have an idea what's going to come, then, good luck. And the same thing with the recap. We wanted to tell right from the beginning to make sure the audience knew that we were showing you something that was realistic but was meant to be laughed at. You have to know you laugh. If you did that show and you didn't know you were supposed to laugh with all the stuff that happens on it, you'd be in big trouble. So I thought, well, how do I do that? Well, I'm sick of doing these recaps, so let me just berate the audience right at the beginning. I wrote like 5 or 6 of them actually yesterday afternoon because we're getting ready to shoot in Chicago and I had to write one. And it's gotten to the point now where one of the ones I wrote yesterday was just a bunch of the cast members staring at the camera, not saying anything, and then Carl spitting at his feet and just glaring at the camera, right? Because now we've established a narrative thing that we can do about anything we want. People yell at you, before you start for missing the show. You probably didn't miss the show, but we're going to yell at you anyway. So it gets you into the right. By the time you've seen the recap, somebody yell at you in the recap, the main title and the show starts, the place, it's like an overture for a certain kind of musical, right? You end it, and the reason for the overture is to get the audience to shut up, but it's also to get you into the place you want them to be at the end of it, which is why the last thing you choose to put into the overture is so important. If the last thing that's in the overture is triumphant and the first scene is slow in its presentation, it will feel slow. If the last thing you put into your overture is a ballad and the most beautiful thing that you have, you can start very slowly in it. So, same thing.
What can you tell us about season 6?
It's done or almost done. Not much. And you know what? Because I did ER all those years and everybody asked me endlessly what's going to happen next, I just said, I don't want to be coy about it. Tune in. Mm-hmm. If you like the show, it's still good. You won't be disappointed, Mm-hmm. It's, we have a blast doing it. Nobody dies. And there's lots to learn about all the characters. Some of it's pretty horrific, and yet I think it's kind of funny. Makes me laugh. Mm-hmm. That's our big conversation with Showtime all the time, is like Gary Levine, who was a huge supporter of the show from the beginning and still is, and it's a big reason why it got on the air. It's always like, John, you sure that's funny? I'm like, I think it's funny. Yeah, I laughed. Yeah, I think it's funny. Well, I showed it to some people here. They didn't think it was funny. And I go, well, I don't know. I thought it was funny. So, what do? You as a writer doing this, you just write what you're interested in, and you hope that other people are interested in it too. And sometimes they aren't. And when they aren't, it's really painful because you're like, really? You sure? you're like begging for any kind of approval.
Has Showtime ever said you've gone a little too far with anything in particular?
Yeah, and then they took it back, and I'm not trying to brag, but they had a lot of trouble at the end of the first season of the show that Frank was going to sleep with Lip's teenage girlfriend. We had a lot of conversations about that. And it ended up working in part because we always thought it would work, but it also worked because the questions that they asked made us answer why she would do it, not why he would do it. But why is she doing it? What's she angry about? And it sort of changed the whole tone. So that's one of those things where notes of you think you want to know someplace you want to go, but you can't quite articulate how you're going to get there. Those notes and those kind of questionings can lead you to ask things of yourself or as the writing staff that deepen something. You know, I mean, we make fun of things that you really shouldn't make fun of, but it's funny and it doesn't demean the thing. Like, you know, we made fun of Make-A-Wish, you know, and it was pretty hilarious. But the Make-A-Wish people were laughing harder than anybody else because, you know what, they're thinking it too. And they called us and said, that was funny. That was funny. And in fact, it made more people aware of it, actually, rather than cynical about it. Or if you did a serious story about Make-A-Wish, you'd be like, who cares? Everybody knows we're supposed to do it, blah, 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 you know? We did a thing about giving limbs to children without limbs. We've got a thing this season about child soldiers, you know, who are like 12 years old and show up and have lots of problems. It's kind of funny. We set somebody on fire this year, not one of our main cast members. It's funny. It's completely wrong, but it's funny. And you're kind of happy he's burning, then you feel really terrible that he's burning. It's like, oh my God, I feel terrible. I'm laughing. Why am I laughing? Well, because honestly, you hated this character so much, you really want him to burn. And guess what? He actually burns.
Oh, all right. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the craft of writing and what your process is. Do you use note cards, a legal pad, computer? What do you do?
I'm really research-based, so I start by just, when I'm going to write it, I want to separate out kind of how we do the series as a whole, and what I do individually. When I'm individually writing a script, I research. I do lots of research. I gather lots of research. I find things that are interesting. Sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's an idea, sometimes it's a piece of dialogue or a little bit of story I've heard or something. And I gather all that together and I kind of talk about it and get notes about, and I ask someone to kind of give me notes about talking about it because I'm kind of, by nature, sort of a storyteller from childhood. So that helps. Like it goes this way or that way. And then I take that and I have dry erase boards and I put the whole thing up on the board as an outline and see how it lines up. And I'm not too rigid about it once I get to it, but I've made the mistake early in my career of starting things that I didn't know where they were going to go, and then I always got in the middle of it and went like, I don't know where this is going, and then I had to start over. So I kind of lay them all out. And then I'll do a draft, that's pretty succinct to what I want it to be, and then I'll go back and do revisions and do, oftentimes, 3, 4, 5 revisions. As a writing staff, we sit down, like on all the shows we've always done this. At the beginning of the season, we'll sit down and everybody has to come in with 20 or 30 ideas. Just stuff. Perfect example in Shameless was Mike O'Malley came in and said, doesn't it irritate you, this Make-A-Wish thing? They call you up and they want you to do something for some kid with cerebral palsy. And he's like a Catholic and like has done a million things for kids with cerebral palsy, but he was irritated about it. Like I have to do something good, right? What if I don't want to do something good? That became a story, right? It was just a thing, just a little thing. So we gather from all, just put it all up on the board. No questions asked. Everything goes up. And a lot of times somebody will pitch something and it turns into something completely different, but it's the thing that starts the thread to what you actually end up talking about. And we put all those up on one big board and we'll have 120, 200 things up there. And we start going through it and saying, what's that? Could it be for this character, that character? And then we have other dry erase boards around the room in which we do, each episode, has a column. And we just start putting stuff into different columns for things. And sort of as a group, because we're writing, in these serialized things, we're kind of writing chapters. And so the one chapter does have to lead into the next. So somebody who's coming after you has to know what it is you're doing so that they know what they're supposed to write. And so we'll go through that until we get enough up there. That usually takes about 4 to 5 weeks of every day, 3-4 hours a day every day. And then I assign individual episodes to individual writers. I'll take 1 or 2. And then we start coming in with outlines like a week apart or 2 weeks apart. So there's a rough draft outline or a story outline, then there's a revised outline that's due a week later, then there's a screenplay that's due 2 weeks after that, then 1 week after that a first draft, then a second draft, then a prepping draft. So by the time we get to the first day of prep, we're always in the third draft of a script. And that allows everybody in the room to kind of contribute. Everybody's supposed to make notes. We yell at each other. We make fun of each other. My favorite note ever was Scott Gemmel, who's now on one of the NCISs, wrote on one of my ER scripts in big letters, "Don't you already have enough Humanitas awards?" Right? I said, "It's a little treacly, huh?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's a little treacly." So, I mean, and I encourage that as the executive producer. I want to be criticized because if I exempt myself from it, it makes the rest of the criticism is harder for everybody else. So it's pretty rough and tumble. It's more like a writer's symposium room in a master's, program somewhere. But it ends up with us kind of getting things done. The most difficult thing when I'm executive producing a series is just finding the quiet time to do it around everything else. So I block out specific times and turn off my phone and just tell people I'm writing and leave me alone. And that's great for everybody else because then they have to do things. They have to make decisions when I'm not around to make them. And then I have to be prepared to live with the decisions they make when I've turned myself off. And sometimes I'm not happy about making that decision.
So when you sit down to write, is there a certain time of day you like to write? Do you have kind of a
There
procedure?
used to be. I used to really only be able to write at night. I think part of that came because when I was first writing, I was also doing a lot of carpentry. I was building houses in Beverly Hills and stuff after my master's degree. And so I'd work till like 3:30 in the afternoon, and then I'd take a shower, get something to eat, and then I could work for 4 or 5 hours at night because the work during the day was manually, not challenging, but you were doing something manually all day long. But then could still, your mind wasn't taken up by it. Some people have trouble doing a day job that then becomes when they can write because the day job is so mentally challenging that it's actually you're kind of like still doing that. I was just pounding nails. So yeah, I used to only write at night, and I came out of theater, so I was sort of up late. But since I've had kids, I write during the day because I'm in bed at 10:30 or 11 because I'm getting up at 6:30 in the morning. Mm-hmm. And so it's mostly during the day. And then occasionally I'll get myself into a bind because I don't want to miss my deadlines because then it's a bad example for everybody else. So sometimes I'll be up late writing, trying to get something done so I don't miss one of my own deadlines and have to yell at myself in the room.
So you mentioned winning a couple Humanitas prizes. You have some Peabodys, a lot of Emmy awards. What do those kind of honors mean to you? I grew up in a family where you're not, you're supposed to not be, you better be aware that you still put your pants on one leg at a time, I think is as my mother used to say. I actually find it fabulous and a little daunting, like, okay, this is the beginning of the end, right? Because it's never going to be, I'll never do this again, right? So, and I like to sort of tell people about the Emmys, been very fortunate, been nominated a lot, been on those shows that you get nominated. Like shows have to be kind of in the zeitgeist at the right moment for those nominations. I've won a couple of times. They were never for the thing that I actually thought was the best thing I wrote, and I'm very conscious of that of there being a timing thing. Of that, all of the Emmys, in particular Peabodys, are for a body of work. People may see that episode and say, wow, they thought that was really great, and they kind of pick it. But almost by the time it gets there, it's because there's a body of work that your peers want to recognize. And that body of work includes a whole bunch of other people. Directors, actors, all of your other writers who are making your work better constantly. So I kind of take it as a moment of like, well, I guess they still haven't figured out that I don't know what I'm doing. Because as a writer, you always feel like you don't know really what you're doing. I mean, right? I mean, you're writing something and it sucks, it doesn't work, and you can't get through it, and it's like, and that feeling never goes away. I remember Michael Crichton telling me,
because I sort of thought he'd written so much. I kind of thought, and he goes, "Oh no, no, today I was terrible. I was just terrible." And he's like 6'10", it's like, "I am terrible." Like Eeyore, like wandering around, I can't do it. And that feeling never goes away. And so when you get an award, it's like a great moment of it. And then knowing like, oof, well, tomorrow I'm going to get up and put on my PJs and sit at my computer again and try and do it again and know that it's going to be really hard. I mean, I think most writers keep writing because, one, because you don't know what else to do, but also because it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do. Because it's never good enough. I mean, you finish, it's always better in your head than when you actually get it on the page. And so then you just have to accept it's what you could get on the page of what sure sounded a lot better when it was in your head,
So we've been focusing on your television career or with the Television Academy, but you've been involved with a number of feature films as well. Does your writing process for film differ than what you do for television at all?
No. And, really I'm not saying anything that everybody doesn't say, but the process of making what I would call kind of higher quality, and by that I just mean a certain kind of narrative drama for television, is the exact same process as making films. What's different about it is that you're telling a closed-end story or you're telling an open-end story. All of the other technical aspects of it are the same. There was, it's not as much anymore, there was a kind of an arrogance in features that was always a little amusing when you're doing a lot of television. But that's all gone now. So it's just writing, and it's all hard, and it's all fun, and it's all a great luxury and privilege to be able to do and to make a living at. But it's the same thing. The biggest thing in films is just people take a long time. So my joke is I've oftentimes written a screenplay or been working with another writer producing a screenplay that maybe I was going to direct or that I was going to produce. We'll finish it. I'll then do a season of Shameless and get my first notes on the screenplay. I mean, literally, it can take 4 and 5 months to get notes on screenplays. So then you got to go back and reread it because you're so far out of the experience of having written it. And then the studios complain that writers take on too many things. Well, part of the reason they take on too many things is you turn something in and you don't hear forever. Nobody's paying you when you don't hear forever. I mean, months, 2 months, 6 months, 8 months. And because I produce a lot of other writers' work, I'm really conscious of calling them up and saying, I'm sorry, I'm trying to speed it up. I don't know. What else are you doing? So no, it's not really different.
What about the directing process between film and television?
You have the luxury of more time in features, and otherwise it's pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. And particularly now it's pretty much the same because the technology allows you to use all the same tools. So you're literally using all the same tools and all the same terminology, and there's really no difference, except usually on feature films you have a little more time. Not nearly as much as you would think because the technology has allowed that time to get squeezed in. If you looked at a lot of the Academy Awards this year, I think you'd be surprised to see that they're mostly 25 to 35-day shooting schedules. So if you're doing 16 days on 2 hours of television, but you're on standing sets and with actors you already know, and then you go into a situation where you don't know people and you're not on standing sets and you're moving a lot of locations, you don't have any more time on set on the feature than you have on set when you're doing the television show. To really work with the actors, so.
Yeah. So you served as president of the Writers Guild of America West twice for the first time.
What's wrong with me?
Particularly the first time in 1999 when you're doing 3 shows at once. Why did you want to be president?
My wife, Marilyn, reminds me of that. The writers, I was on the board for a long time before that and was the secretary treasurer and the vice president, and I just ran out of other jobs I could do and agreed to do it. And it was kind of crazy. It was a really difficult period of my life. Working, as in everything else that I do, I was lucky to be working with a bunch of other people who were really talented at the Guild. The difficulty at the Guild, I think, with elective offices is that people can get confused and think that they're full-time elected offices, and they're not. We have an extraordinarily talented professional staff that really knows what they're doing. So you want to be useful in talking, kind of bringing to the staff the experience in the workplace. But you don't want to get in the way of them actually doing what they know how to do and you don't know how to do. And so I thought it was when the opportunity or when the time came for me to run for president, because I had every other office I could possibly have. I thought, I know it's not going to be a full-time job for me. It can't even be close to a full-time job for me. But I think it could maybe be an example to other people who have busy professional lives that it's possible to do. And it is possible to do, and I think it has led to more people feeling as if they could do it while they pursued their full-time careers. But it means that you're trusting completely in the executive director. We've got a wonderful executive staff. These people are really talented. And so you try to provide guidance in that board role and leadership without interfering with the day-to-day operations of the Guild and the people who really know how to do it.
So what were some of the main concerns of the Guild in 1999 during your first term?
Well, they aren't that different than they are now. I mean, in the sense that the business was changing rapidly, we could kind of look forward to a completely different type of distribution system, which has come to be, whatever it is now, 14 years later. So we were trying to constantly look at what was in our contracts, knowing that the companies would try not to pay us. Only natural for them to try not to pay us for new ways of distributing the product. And it's balancing what can you get done with the leverage that you have, what can you take advantage of, because the companies and they're the first to admit this, they're very quarterly driven. So the Guild can afford to have a longer view of getting things than the companies can. And so we were in the midst then of a huge boom in the DVD market and a decline in the foreign revenue markets, particularly for television syndication and everything from film that was syndicated in foreign. So we knew their eye wasn't on that ball. So we got our foreign numbers way up for revenues because we could wait. And now 10 years later, it didn't even take 10, but like 4 or 5 years later, it came way up. But we were addressing in 2001 what we ended up having to strike over in 2007, which was the way in which things were going to be distributed digitally. At that time in 2001, we were able to argue that the revenue that's produced for on what is now what's now thought of as I just forgot the actual term for it, but what's now thought of as a pay-per-view, like a specific download, like if you're just going to rent something, if you're just going to click on it on cable and you just want to watch that, and they're going to charge you like $1.99 or $4.99 or whatever it is. We made the argument that that was already covered in the contract. We needed to clarify that it was covered in the contract on the internet or on that kind of direct use, or on cable on that direct use, and they were prepared to agree to that. They would not agree to the percentage being different than the DVD percentage, which was artificially low and is still artificially low for sales or the sell-through of those materials on directly to the consumer. So that's what we ended up on strike for, really, in 2007, was to clarify that, which we were able to, everybody worked really hard, and we had wonderful leadership at the Guild, both in the executive and in the elected leadership, to get that number up to, multiples of where it had been. It was not fully where it should be, nor is it now fully where it should be. Now there's arguments about whether the subscription video on demand services, Netflix, how are those covered? How's that covered? So the entire business is changing so quickly that the Guild constantly has to be addressing these changes in the way the distribution system works. Because the companies are always trying to maximize their revenue, particularly in a world in which the revenues seem to be declining because there's so much available product. So we were battling about that, and we were battling about the film buy, which we will forever battle about. And I've had massive screaming arguments with many good friends in the Directors Guild about it, simply because I come out of the world of the theater where we all make this together, and no one person does it. And there are people who have larger roles in doing it in the sense of what that creative thing is going to be. But there is no film that's by someone. That's how I feel strongly, and the Guild felt strongly about it, and we made a lot of noise about it and got nowhere contractually, and there's been a huge fall off in the number of directors who will actually take it, because we were actually able to make the case that it's dismissive of all of your collaborators, not just the writers, but everybody else who's making it.
So we just have a few summing up questions now. Do you want to take a little break, or should we just keep going?
No, I'm good if you
All
guys
right.
are. Do you have enough tape
Yep.
or whatever it is?
Salad or anything?
Go out and eat it in a minute.
Okay. We want to talk a little bit about mentors. You mentioned John Worth had been a big influence. Anybody else, or anything else you'd like to say about him?
Yeah, well, there have been a ton of them, right? I mean, nobody gets to any place in their career without a bunch of them. I had a theater director in high school who encouraged me and actually thought that you could make a living doing it, which seemed ridiculous in Arapahoe County, Colorado. I had a guy by the name of Rob Weston, who was the stage manager at the Country Junior Playhouse, who encouraged me to do it and that I could make a living at it. A gentleman by the name of Fred Ewens, who's a character whose name is now in. It's not actually Fred, but Ewens is the mentor character for Lip in this season of Shameless, who encouraged me to pursue the directing as well, and encouraged me to try and expand beyond the things that I was doing then. Art Murphy at USC in the Peter Stark program, who was the toughest, nastiest professor I've ever had in my life. Brutal, but prepared me for internships where I was in a room with Barry Diller, who's no easy guy to work with and for, and many others since. John Worth, who was absolutely, Roger Director, who kept me going when I was really trying to get going as a freelancer, and when he was over at Moonlighting. John Worth, who taught me everything he knew about how to do it with absolute generosity, and actually thought it was part of his responsibility to make sure that anybody who came up underneath him knew how to do the job as a producer on a television show, a writer-producer, which I've tried to take seriously since then. John Young, unbelievably talented, brought me into that world and let me be in a show that made other people think that I actually could be on a good show. There was nothing in my resume before that would support that. And then I look, it's kind of odd, but I look as so many of the writers and producers who I have worked with who officially were working for me were actually mentoring me through that whole process, because mentoring is about learning from other people, right? And being made better by the people that you work with. And that's just happened over and over and over again, and continues to happen to this day. It's fun to do because you go to work every day and you learn something new, and there's something new you haven't done before, and you know something you can help somebody else with, and they tell you something that you didn't know about life, about themselves, about their experiences, about writing, about how to make a joke work that you didn't think could work, about how to do a shot that you didn't know could work, about how to ask more of an actor who says to you, I can do more, give me more to do, and then does it, right? It just never stops.
What do you like about writing?
There's a premise to that question, which is that
Do you like writing?
Do you like writing? I like when something's finished. It's brutal when you're writing, right? I mean, it's just disappointment after disappointment in yourself and your endless failures for the scene not being better. But man, when a scene works or something works, there's nothing better. And I like the fact that I'll never get it completely, right? You never really get the perfect thing, and it ends up being so temporal, particularly television, that it's gone quick, and that's sort of cool because it's just out there and it's done, and then there's something else that needs to be doing, and you look for another story, or you look to hear something else that's interesting from somebody else. You get to talk to somebody who's interesting. I think probably the thing if I get to point to one thing that I like the most, is that I get to go out into these worlds that I will never do and learn something about something I don't know anything about. Whether that was medicine on ER or about the specific experiences of all these different people in Vietnam, or the West Wing, working in the West Wing, what that's like, who those people are, where do they come from. The political conversations were the things I missed the most when we finished the West Wing, because there were all these political people who had worked in the White House. And the first hour of every writers' meeting was just them arguing about whatever was going on in the news, right? I mean, where do you get to do that? Shameless, just hearing everybody's life stories. I just did this movie that completely tanked called Burnt. But I spent a year in kitchens with chefs, like 16 hours a day, once or twice a week, with them, learning about this entire world that I thought I knew a lot about, and it turned out I didn't know anything about. We just did this Beach Boy movie, Love and Mercy, that we worked on for about 10 years. And, learning about the creation of music from the musicians, hearing about how they did it and how it came together, and then watching it all get pulled apart and put back together by Bill Pohlad, who directed the picture, but also Atticus Ross, who took all of Brian Wilson's stuff. He had all these tapes and things from Brian, and he pulled them all apart and he put them back together in the film, in the soundtrack, I didn't know anything about that. So I get to still be excited about what I do because I'm learning all the time.
What about the producing process? What do you like about that part?
I don't like much about the producing process. I don't hate the producing process, but I see it as just a means to allow me to get to do what I like to do. Mm-hmm. And when it's controlled by someone else, I find it to be oftentimes more chaotic than it needs to be. And I don't like that chaos because it keeps me from writing. I don't mind the chaos just because it's chaos. I mind it because it sucks up time that we could be doing something more fun.
Mm-hmm. What about directing? Do you enjoy directing?
I do enjoy directing, and I think it's extremely valuable for writers to direct, because you have to get in with the actors and really understand what they're going through, and it makes you a better writer. And it's greatly aggrandized as to what kind of power you're really going to have you to do it, and I've done a lot of it. And you go into it always thinking, well, now I can really do it, and it's not that at all. So, but it's really a wonderful, different kind of thing to be able to do. That's the different muscles to be able to exercise, and I think it makes me a much better writer when I get back to it. Some of it's because you don't write things that can't be directed anymore because you've had to try and do them, and you went like, well, who wrote that? Oh no, it was me. I don't even know how to do that. So you get better at that part of it, but also just getting back onto the set with the actors on a series and being there and communicating and talking, and the danger when you're executive producing series and writing series is that there is a little bit of an us and them. It's the set and the room, right? And no matter how much you think you're on the set, you're not really on the set. So when you direct, you're on the set from call to wrap. And just like if you were a documentarian, first people kind of are nice around you, and then they just start going about their business, and you actually see what the world really is. The same thing happens when you're directing. If you're a writer or executive producer, you come out of the set, everybody's on their best behavior for a few minutes, or their worst, depending on what's going on. And then you're gone, and then they get back to what they normally do. When you're directing, you're there long enough that everybody forgets that you're sort of there as anything other than just the director, until you actually see what's going on, who's pissed at who and who's having trouble, and what's really working between the actors and what isn't. And so it's really valuable.
What would you say is your proudest career achievement?
Wow.
It's a small question.
It's gonna sound a little Pollyannish, so forgive me. I'm still get to do it, right? When it sounds sort of silly, but I grew up in Colorado, right? And nobody did it. Well, I didn't know anybody who did it, and I didn't have any of my family who did it, and so the big challenge for me was all along was, would I really get to do it? And there was a lot of years where I wasn't sure. So I still get kind of a thrill just kind of driving onto the lot, and I have to remind myself sometimes, when you're directing something and you come out and you look around and you realize, oh, wait a second, there are like 40 trucks out here and 200 people, and and then I think like, oh yeah, I still get to do this. That's really it, right? I think the real danger is that you start to think of things as individual moments and stop thinking about just that what we all really want to do is just have a career, where at the end of it, you're still doing it, you know. I ended up oddly being friends with, they're lovely, with David Crosby and Graham Nash. I got to know them through some unusual circumstances. But I went to one of the recording sessions in one of their albums, and more recent albums, and David was very frustrated with the fact, he said, I think the music's pretty good, and I don't know if anybody will hear it. You know, we're 70 years old, and who listens to our music anymore? And Graham looked at him and said, we're still playing music, man, right? That's my proudest accomplishment. I'm going to be 60 in a few months, and they haven't thrown me out of the business yet, you know? So I actually got to do it, right?
Any regrets about anything?
Oh, a million regrets, right? About the way you behave, about things you could have handled better, about things when you look back at it, boy, I wonder if I'd done that, if it would be this or that. But you just have to kind of keep moving forward and hope that you, you know, have treated people well enough, and that you haven't been let too much of it go to your head, and that you, you know, I mean, I have lots of regrets. I could name you 50 of them. Things I could have handled better, that I should have handled differently, that in hindsight I should have handled differently. I can't put myself back exactly into the moment when I did it that way and know exactly what I felt. So I just have to accept that that's what I did. A lot of things I'm very proud of, and a lot of things I'm not proud of at all. Can't go back and make up for them. All I can do is try and handle it differently when this similar thing shows up in the future.
What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out as a writer?
Advice, I get asked that a lot, as you might imagine. Mm-hmm. You have to really love it. My friend Alfred Urey, who did Driving Miss Daisy, didn't really make a living as a writer until he was 54, and then he won the Academy Award. You have to really love it. You have to want to do it. You have to keep at it and just keep writing. Stephen Botchkama, when I first went in to meet him, asked me a question I didn't know how to answer. He said, how big a stack do you have? And I said, what? And he goes, on the floor, like, you know, is it like just this far off the floor? Is it this far off the floor? Is it this far off the floor if you stack them all up on the floor? And I said, I don't know, it's probably about in here somewhere. And he goes, come back and talk to me when it's here. It's a craft, right? There's talent, there's imagination, but there's also craft. And you just have to do it repetitively. You would never expect in any other job to not serve an apprenticeship to learn how to do something that's really hard to do. And you will get better. I think I get better, you know. Don Mankiewicz, who I served on the board with, you know, called me when he died this last year, and he called me when he had to be about 86 or 87. He said, I just wrote something really good. Nobody will read it because I'm an old fucker. But I can still write. I'm still good. And I read it and I said, yeah, Don, I think this is really good, right? So it's staying at it and knowing that you just have to write all the time. One of the people I went to school with who was a writer, used to run into him, not often, but I would run into him at a mutual friend of ours, Christmas party every year, and I'd ask him what he was doing. He would tell me, and after a couple of years I realized he was telling me the same script he was working on. Finish it, start another one. I think I was on the 8th, 9th, 10th thing that I'd written and rewritten before I even showed anything to anybody. It takes a while. Mm-hmm. Some people are just naturally talented, it goes right at them. But I promise you that over time they will also go through ups and downs in their careers, and you just got to keep writing because you get better by repetition.
And then our last question is, where do you see yourself in 10 years?
Well, you know, I'll tie it back to the earlier question, which is, you know, hopefully they still let me do it. I'm not going to be doing 66 episodes in a year in 10 years. It's just a matter of stamina and wanting to have a little bit more of a life, you know, with your family. And but I hope they still let me do it. And, you know, you can't just do it on your own. It's, you know, television and film requires somebody else pay for it and pays a lot for it. So at some point, somebody's going to decide, yeah, I think he's had everything he had to say, and then I'll have to figure out some other way to write that doesn't require me getting people to write big checks.
Well, we hope you're around for a long time.
We'll see.
Thanks so much for sitting down with us today, John. This was great.
Thank you. This was more fun than I expected it to be.
Oh, good.
Thanks.
All right. You're free.